Chapter 29, Dream Girl. One night, a young freelance theater critic, Herb Worth, brought his fiancée to a performance of Mr. Roberts. This was before I joined the production, and David Wayne was still playing Pulver. For some reason, they sat way up in the balcony, and his date, a young dancer named Patricia Poole, had trouble hearing the show. Still, she thought it must have been very funny, because everyone up front was laughing so hard. So she decided to go back and see it again, only this time she went by herself. By now, I was in the show, and Pat Poole, in the better seat, laughed from beginning to end, but she especially liked the new Ensign Pulver, whom she recognized as her old classmate, the crazy one who used to copy her homework and got thrown out for reading his essay on how to beat the races. Pat Poole had been working hard as a dancer in the years since her family arrived in New York City, always dreaming of dancing on the big stages. She got her chance at age 16 when she joined the ballet company for the summer of 1947 at Radio City Music Hall. Most people have heard of the famous Rockettes and their leggy production numbers, but Radio City also has a ballet group, meaning dancers who worked on point, on their toes. Not that they dance only ballet. In fact, most of the acts for the ballet troupe were ballroom style, and the girls were among the very best dancers in the world. They were less famous, but at least as prestigious in the dance community as the Rockettes. It was at this point that Pat made the most difficult decision of her life. She had been dancing with her brother Robbie throughout her entire childhood. As kids, they were billed as the world's youngest exhibition ballroom team, and they were terrific together. Tremendously talented, Pat and Robbie had several signature numbers, their favorite being their dance to the tune of Jealousy. They were hits at all the competitions. But there comes a point in every life when each person has to make their own decision as to what they're shooting for. What are their dreams and their aspirations? We all do it, or should, and it isn't selfishness. It's part of understanding who we are as individuals. One thing we know about life is that we're happiest and most productive when doing what we truly love and moving towards some goal that is our dream. For Pat, that dream simply was not as a dance partner. As she grew older, she came to better understand that, realizing her potential meant going it alone. And she was right. Her mother knew she was right, and Robbie understood it too. So in one of the most painful moments of her young life, Pat decided it was time to end the dance partnership. To her surprise, Robbie understood perfectly. I believe he was relieved. Shortly afterward, Robbie returned to North Carolina. There he finished college, married a wonderful girl, Barbara, and raised a family in Lynchburg, Virginia. Robbie was happiest there. Had he wished to continue in the dance world, he could have stayed in New York, and doors would have opened for him, just as they did for Pat. But like his father, Robbie never shared Helen's intense aspirations. Pat was much more like her mother. I believe Robbie was released from a burden. Ending the partnership allowed him to return to his roots and live a wonderfully happy life with Barbara and their 4 terrific children. Pat remained close to Robbie throughout their entire lives. Their childhood had built a bond between them that was enduring, and they continued to share the memories of their years on the dance floor. In 1999, Robbie collapsed of a heart attack. He died instantly. We went to the funeral in Charlotte, North Carolina. I don't think I've ever seen my wife so sad. Robbie was her childhood confidant. It was Robbie who understood better than anyone the difficulties Pat endured as a child and the hard work she undertook in her quest to be a great dancer. When Pat had to say goodbye to Robbie, there was a part of her that went with him. I've never expressed it as fully as I have here, but his death was a great sorrow in Pat's life and a terrible loss for all of us. At 17, Pat graduated from the Professional Children's School and soon joined Radio City Music Hall's Corps de Ballet full-time. For several years she danced in all the great Radio City productions, including the famous Christmas and Easter shows. Then one day, Pat had her own brush with greatness. She heard about auditions for a new theatrical production called Courtin' Time, in which the producers were trying to create another Oklahoma, which had just finished its hugely successful run at the 44th Street Theater in 1948. The lead in Courtin' Time was Lloyd Nolan, a great actor and very popular at the time. But the show's real attraction was the choreographer, none other than George Balanchine. By this time, Balanchine was already widely considered the greatest choreographer in the history of American dance. When Pat heard about Balanchine's involvement, she was desperate to have a shot at the audition. But the producers at Radio City didn't want their dancers heading out on auditions. They were afraid of losing them, especially the girls in the ballet corps, who were among the most talented dancers in New York City. So they cleverly arranged their own rehearsals at the exact time they knew the Broadway shows were having their auditions. Despite this, Pat had managed to go to the first one when the field was winnowed from around 500 to 100 dancers. The next audition, however, landed right at the time of a Radio City Ballet Corps rehearsal, and Pat couldn't go. But Pat outsmarted them. She wrote a letter directly to Balanchine and left it at the stage door, asking if she could skip the second audition and come to the finals. She was pleasantly surprised when they agreed. For the final audition, each of the girls had to dance on point. One by one, they moved across the stage on their toes, doing turns as they went. Pat was toward the back of the line. When her time came, she took off dancing and turning until arriving at the end of the stage. There she looked out and saw Balanchine standing in the aisle. He was pointing right at her, as if to say, "That one." She was absolutely thrilled. Nothing could compare to receiving that kind of recognition from one of the greatest figures in dance history. Later that night, she told her mother all about it. To have her daughter singled out by Balanchine was a great thrill for Helen as well, who rightly saw it as vindication for the difficult decision she had made many years before to give her children a shot at dancing on the big stage in New York City. Pat joined Courtin' Time. She got to know Balanchine pretty well, and he impressed her as well as a real gentleman. Although supremely self-confident, he was never dismissive of others and never allowed his great stature to interfere with his decency as a person. Pat recalls a special moment while they were on the road. After a rehearsal, Balanchine said to Pat, "Well, I'm going across the street to have a coffee. Would you like to come?" So they went together for coffee, and while at the table, one of the singers in the show rushed up all excited. "Oh, Mr. Balanchine, I want to introduce my friend. This is Anna." And with that, Balanchine sat back and said, "How do you do?" Then, realizing that Pat had been ignored, Balanchine turned to Pat, and without missing a beat, said to the couple, "And I would like you to meet my mother." Pat was all of 20 at the time, and could have passed for 16. Everyone laughed, but his inclusion of Pat in the conversation and his sensitivity to the feelings of those around him was a reflection of his strong character. Balanchine directed his dances in a uniquely relaxed manner. Most other choreographers were forever screaming at the dancers, but Balanchine spoke softly. Pat recalls his pensive style. "He was the first choreographer I'd worked with," she says, "who was quiet. You'd see him thinking, and he would blink his eyes in a certain way, and then he'd go up to you and show you very softly how to do it correctly." Her description reminds me of a similar change I'd seen on Broadway. Elia Kazan was the very first director I worked with who wouldn't shout. When he had some instruction for an actor, he would give it in a soft, calm, relaxed manner. No doubt his personal style had a great deal to do with his training in the method style, where reaching inward was as important as projecting outward. Perhaps Pat was seeing a similar transition with new theories of dance. Another of Pat's fascinating encounters during courting time had little to do with dancing. Just as courting time was preparing for its Broadway run, the United States was still in the thick of the Korean War. After the initial success of General Douglas MacArthur's invasion at the Korean port of Incheon, the Chinese entered the conflict and the war bogged down. As a result, a well-publicized feud began between MacArthur and President Harry Truman, leading to the general's dismissal in April of 1951. He then returned home, his first trip to the mainland in 14 years, where he received one of the biggest welcomes in history. I still recall the ticker-tape parade in New York City, which was the largest ever. MacArthur finished his tour of America with an address to a joint session of Congress, where he famously ended with his bittersweet lament that old soldiers never die, they just fade away. A few weeks later, he decided to take in a Broadway show. Pat recalls the excitement at the end of the performance as everyone lined up in a semicircle on stage to shake hands with this legendary five-star general who had defeated Japan in World War II and ruled over the Japanese islands for years after the war. Now he was back home, taking in a Broadway play like everyone else. Pat still vividly recalls shaking his hand with a degree of amazement at the presence of this bigger-than-life figure. Notwithstanding Balanchine's marvelous choreography and a boost from the former Supreme Allied Commander, courting time lasted only a week on Broadway. Regrettably, they lost their star, Lloyd Nolan, who developed problems with his vocal cords and was unable to sing. Once he was replaced, the show never gained much traction. Still, Pat's brief association with George Balanchine made it worthwhile, and it was a testament to her tremendous talent. Balanchine wanted dancers with the ability to express his vision. Only a few had that unique talent, and my future wife was among them. I've always been so proud of her marvelous accomplishments on stage, and so grateful that along the way she chose to spend her lifetime with me. From courting time, Pat went immediately into Two on the Aisle, starring Bert Lahr, the famous Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. From there, she worked in a number of other venues, including a stint of dancing on The Steve Allen Show. She was quickly making herself a reputation as one of the best young dancers in New York City when she heard about tryouts for a dance company established to work with the new comic sensation Jackie Gleason. The head of the company was June Taylor, the sister of Gleason's future wife Marilyn, who was a dancer in the group and remains a good friend of ours today. Soon these dancers would become famous the world over as the June Taylor Dancers. Jackie Gleason had now worked his way up through the clubs in New York City, where Helen first worked with him, to B films in Hollywood, and then to his big break in 1949 when he landed the lead role on The Life of Riley. I have a strong memory of the show, and of Gleason, because it began the same year as I remember Mama. But I also remember him because I truly believe he was among a very elite group of great entertainers. Milton Berle, Lou Costello, and Jimmy Durante were other comics who come to mind. But Gleason had one advantage over most everyone. He was also a great dramatic actor, with such timeless roles as Minnesota Fats in The Hustler and Mace Rennick in Requiem for a Heavyweight, directed by my friend Ralph Nelson, who felt the same about Gleason's prodigious talents. In 1950, Jackie began hosting Dumont's Cavalcade of Stars on the Dumont Channel, which later moved to CBS and was renamed The Jackie Gleason Show. Gleason always loved the old Busby Berkeley musicals extravaganzas of the 1930s with their elaborate dance routines, and he worked similar numbers into his variety show. His penchant for these spectacular numbers caused him to rely more and more on his own June Taylor dances, which were becoming a central feature on his programs. By 1952, Gleason had already developed many of television's unforgettable characters: Reginald Van Gleason, Rudy the Repairman, Joe the Bartender, and of course Ralph Cramden, the ever-scheming, loud-mouthed, but lovable Brooklyn bus driver. As the show's popularity soared, he increased the number of June Taylor dances to 16, and Pat set out to land one of the new spots. Gleason, with a style all his own, turned the audition itself into a spectacle. He arranged for Life magazine to cover it, and once June had narrowed the field to about 50 qualified girls, Gleason had them all parade down Broadway to his suite at the Park Central Hotel, with Life magazine photographers snapping away as they went. Once inside, each girl had to walk one at a time in front of Jackie, who would tell them, "Pull your skirt up to your knee." This was obviously before the days of harassment lawsuits. Pat was chosen. She worked on the Jackie Gleason Show for 2 years, beginning in 1952, and was featured in a number of the routines choreographed by June Taylor. Recently, my kids and I watched one from 1953 in which Pat was featured on an old reel, and we all just marveled at her amazing talent. In 1953, Gleason chose 6 of his dancers to go to Europe during the summer break. Pat wasn't among them. Annoyed at not being selected, Pat decided to break off and form her own dance act. She contacted a choreographer from the Steve Allen Show who worked up a series of dance routines for her. But before things got underway, Pat's godmother, Marie Spataro, decided to take a trip to Europe and asked Pat to come along. Before leaving, Pat mentioned to Gleason that she was also going to Europe for the summer with her godmother. He took her aside and, in typical Gleason fashion, handed her a note and said goodbye. When he left, she opened it, and there was a $50 bill inside with a message that read, "Have your first drink in Europe on me." Pat still has the note. Pat then sailed for Europe and had a wonderful time with her godmother. She also had the last laugh on Jackie, because when she returned on the U.S. Constitution, the New York paparazzi showed up at the dock in Manhattan. As she came off the cruise liner, they photographed her, and the next day her picture was on the front page of the New York Daily News. After arriving home, Pat's mother received a phone call and yelled out to her, "It's Gleason on the phone." So she took the phone, and Jackie invited her to his place in the Adirondacks in upstate New York. "I have this house," he said, "and everybody comes up for the weekends. They usually spend the night, and we have a party, and it's a lot of fun. Would you like to come?" By now, Pat and I were dating, but I was always away doing summer stock, so Pat took my sister Joyce, and the two rode up to Gleason's house on the train. At the party, Gleason's producer, Jack Philbin, told her they wanted her back for the next season. Philbin was surprised when Pat told him, "I'm not coming back." She explained she was putting together her own act and was planning to take it on the road. He took it with a certain degree of disbelief and even umbrage that she would have the temerity to dare to leave this hugely successful show and strike out on her own. She still remembers Philbin looking down his nose at her and scoffing, "Well, get her." But Philbin didn't know my wife, and she went off to better things on the Broadway stage and elsewhere. Many years later, I met Jackie at Morton's Steakhouse in Chicago. He invited me to sit at his table. I remember his booming voice. "Sit down, have a drink, Dick." I told him I didn't drink and was about to order a Coca-Cola when he commanded, "Nobody sits with me and doesn't drink." so I ordered something and nursed it while we talked. He remembered Pat, and we talked about the old days in New York. When Pat saw me and Mr. Roberts, she was still dancing at Radio City. Later, when she joined the Gleason show, she and the other June Taylor dancers rehearsed in the afternoon at New York's Grand Central Station, the same place we rehearsed Mama in the morning. One day, I was watching the dancers come in and spotted the prettiest girl I'd ever seen. I remarked to the director, Ralph Nelson, "Look at that girl. She's so beautiful. I could marry her tomorrow." Ralph laughed and said, "What kind of nonsense is that? You don't even know her." So I approached her to strike up some kind of a conversation, and she looked at me and said, "Don't you remember me? I'm Pat Poole, and we used to sit next to each other at the professional children's school." Suddenly I remembered the pretty little blonde whose homework I copied. She told me she had seen me and Mr. Roberts and really enjoyed the show. I was ecstatic. Immediately I began thinking of ways to connect with this bombshell. I discussed it with Ralph Nelson, and he came up with a great idea. Ralph suggested we put a small dance number into one of the Mama episodes. He would then call Gleason and ask him to send her over to teach me the dance. I thought it was a great idea, and so Ralph called Gleason, told him what we wanted, and specified that it had to be the young girl named Pat. It worked like a charm. The next day, Pat came to our rehearsal to teach me the turkey trot. We worked on it every day for a week. Then I invited her to come and see the show, which was broadcast live on Friday night. I was delighted when she agreed to come, but she showed up with her fiancé. Rosemary Rice, who played Catherine on Mama, came to the rescue. She suggested that she host a small party for the people in the show and invite Pat, but she would stress to her that she should come alone. Rosemary came through. Later that night, Pat showed up at Rosemary's apartment on East 55th Street. It wasn't really a party, just me, Ralph, and Rosemary, and at first Pat thought it was all very strange and was about to leave, but Rosemary coaxed her into staying, and we ended up having a great time. At the end of the night, I finally told Pat that I wanted to start seeing her. She reminded me that she was engaged, but I just ignored that and kept at her. After a while, she relented, and for a time, Pat was dating the both of us. I knew that could only last for a while. Pat was working all day, then going out with her boyfriend Herb, and afterwards heading back out again with me for a midnight movie. But I had a good plan. I realized that the best way to get Pat was through her mother, and the best way to get to her mother was to buy her ice cream. So every night while Pat was out with Herb, I'd come around the apartment plying Helen with quarts of ice cream. It worked. In short order, Helen was on my side. In the meantime, things had become complicated for Pat on a professional level. Agnes DeMille, the great choreographer and niece of film great Cecil B. DeMille, contacted her about the possibility of taking a lead dance role in a revival of Oklahoma as it went on the road. She would be the central ballet dance to Florence Henderson's Beautiful Singing. One of the biggest hits in Broadway history, Oklahoma, written by Rodgers and Hammerstein, had run from 1942 through 1948 and was now headed for the road after its revival at the City Center Theater. At the same time, Pat had an opportunity to dance in another Rodgers and Hammerstein show, the production of Me and Juliet, which was already running on Broadway. The stage manager had asked her to come see the show, so she and my mother went to a performance. She enjoyed it immensely and took the job, dancing in the chorus with a talented young dancer named Shirley MacLaine. Shortly after Pat and I began dating, she separated with Herb. I had fallen in love with her, and for the first time in my life, I began to think seriously about marriage. Still, I had enjoyed my independence for quite a number of years, and I knew that if I married her, those days would end. At the same time, I realized Pat was the one for me, and by the beginning of 1954, I had made up my mind that I could not live without her. Around that time, I became close friends with Maxie Rosenblum, a great boxer who had been the light heavyweight champion of the world in the 1930s. Maxie and I met at a place called A Bird in Hand on 51st Street and Broadway, where all the actors and theater people would hang out after the shows. I remember Steve McQueen was there every night. He wasn't a star yet, and I still recall that he had big bags under his eyes that distracted from his good looks. I've always thought he must have had surgery because he was so handsome in the movies. Maxie lived in the Piccadilly Hotel on West 45th Street. He was a legend in New York City, not only as a great boxer, but as a stand-up comic. Maxie did a hilarious routine, and I'm sure that the boxing legend Jake LaMotta, who also became famous for his comedy act, took his cue from Maxie. Pat loved Maxie. We used to hang out every night. I remember Maxie telling me, "You had better marry that girl." Pat, who really didn't know much about boxing, was especially impressed one night when we went to see a fight at Eastern Parkway's arena, and Maxie came with us. When we arrived, the three of us got out of the car and started walking toward the stadium. Suddenly, a crowd gathered around. Within moments, we were being mobbed. By the time we were about a block from the arena, there was a huge throng of people on all sides of us chanting, "Maxie, Maxie, Maxie, Maxie Rosenblum." As we entered, the fans inside went crazy as soon as they saw him. I'd been on television, radio, and Broadway, but none of that even remotely compared to the adulation that these fans had for this truly unique boxing legend. It was an exciting night, and Pat still recalls her astonishment that her friend was so revered. Like so many of the old-timers from New York, Maxie is gone now. I guess that makes it safe for me to tell another story that I'm not so proud of. Maxie was a big horse player, and we often went to Belmont Park together. One afternoon, after the 6th race, Maxie had to leave. He gave me $100 and told me to bet it evenly on a horse in each of the 2 remaining races. I remember that the horses were number 4 and number 7. He said if number 4 wins, bet it right back on number 7. When he left, I looked at his choices and thought neither one had much of a chance, so I got the bright idea of pocketing the $100 rather than placing the bets and losing. If Maxie did get lucky on one of them, I'd just pay him. It was a terrible thing to do, but I was young and reckless, and the idea that this was a betrayal of his trust never really entered my mind. Well, I got exactly what I deserved. Maxie's horses won both races. Had I had bet the money, he would have gotten $1,600. Instead, I walked out of the track with his $100 and wondering what the heck I was going to tell him, the former light heavyweight champion of the world, the next morning at breakfast when he'd come looking for his cash. Desperate, I had another bright idea. I was still early enough to make a bet on a baseball game. It was particularly stupid because I didn't know anything about baseball. Also, I didn't have enough money to make a bet that would recoup Maxie's losses. But there was a sports bookie I knew, Zip Russo, over on 51st Street and Broadway, who would take the bet over the phone with the understanding that I'd be good for it if I lost. So I called up, and I bet $1,600 I didn't have on the Yankees. It was a 6-5 pick'em, which meant I wouldn't get back even money, and so I had to bet a lot. If I lost, of course, I'd be in a real jam. But someone was looking out for me that night. The Yankees won by 16 runs. I've never seen such a walkover. I went to the bookie, got the cash, and the next morning met and paid Maxie, acting like nothing had ever happened. But I do thank God he never knew what I did. I just congratulated him on his 2 great picks and never mentioned how much grief those 2 horses had really caused me. The great thing about Maxie is that he really loved Pat. As I mentioned, he kept telling me, "You've got to marry that girl." Maxie was right. Still, I took my time and nearly lost my chance. I found out later that Pat was getting tired of waiting. By the spring of 1954, she had expected me to ask her already. One day, we had to go to the wedding of one of her friends, a dancer named Joan Donovan. Pat later told me if I had not asked her on that very day, she was moving on. At the same time, I also realized that if I didn't take the plunge, I could lose the best girl I'd ever known. So I picked her up in my '49 Oldsmobile convertible at her apartment on West 67th Street. When she got in the car, I just sat there for a moment with the car parked. I don't know why, maybe because of the wedding, but it just suddenly came out. Well, I was thinking that maybe we should get married. And just as a matter of fact, Pat responded, "Oh, well, when would you want to do that?" I was looking straight ahead in the car, and so was she. Well, I was thinking that Easter is coming up, and I thought that April 25th. And she said, "I would like to have a family." So I responded, "Well, I was thinking I would like to have a family." And that was the end of it. I turned the engine on, and we drove to the wedding without saying a single word. But when we arrived at the reception, I just couldn't contain myself. I told everyone, "We're engaged." In retrospect, it was in very bad taste, stealing a bit of the thunder from Joan's wedding. From that inauspicious proposal, Pat and I have enjoyed 55 wonderful and romantic years that just keep getting better and better. We were married on April 25th, 1954, in a small church, St. Malachy's, in what was appropriately called the Actors' Chapel. The whole cast and crew of Mama was there, as well as many of the June Taylor dancers. My grandfather Vincent was my best man, and Pat's best friend, Dolores Dawson, was her maid of honor. She was stunning in her white wedding dress, and it was the happiest day of my life.